Very good afternoon to all of you. Let us start the course for the second day. We are discussing about the operating systems overview, and in the last class we have covered up to the basics of operating system, and we have completed up to the basic concepts of operating system, the different modules in operating system, along with the basic concept of process and threads, and what are the different modules which are there in our operating system. So, in the last class we are discussing about this queuing diagram for process scheduling. So, what we have discussed that a process scheduler, its basic task is to fetch a process from the ready queue, then execute it, and based of different type of events that can happen like a interrupt or an IO request, a process can move between multiple types of queues. So, referring to this diagram that we were discussing in the last class, initially the process is inside the ready queue, and then the process is fetched by a CPU and the process goes to the CPU scheduler. So, the scheduler takes a process from the ready queue, put it to the CPU for execution. Once the process execution is over, it goes out of the system. During the process execution, if different type of events happen like IO request, if a IO request happen, then the process moves to the IO queue for the IO operation. If the time slice expire for multitasking environment, then the process is again put to the ready queue. The process can fork a child process to create a parent process can create a child process, and once the child gets created, initially it is put to the ready queue. Then again if a process gets an interrupt, it may be a hardware interrupt or a software interrupt, then because of the interrupt the process leaves the CPU and it again moves to the ready queue. So, this way a process basically changes its state based on the process state diagram that we discussed in the last class. There are multiple type of schedulers which are available, which actually helps the process to move from one state to another state based on the process state diagram. So, the base scheduler is a short term scheduler, or it is called a CPU scheduler. So, the purpose of the short term scheduler is to select which process should be executed next, and it allocates the CPU to that particular process. So, the short term scheduler basically fetches a process from the ready queue and then allocate the CPU to that particular process for the process execution. So, in many of the system, this short term scheduler or the CPU scheduler is the only scheduler which is there in the system, and this short term scheduler is invoked very frequently. So, in the order of milliseconds, that is, it is very fast, and the purpose for this is that while you are running a process, there are multiple processes which are there. If you are in general, we execute a multitasking environment, and in a multitasking environment, once a time quanta expires, then the process need to be released from the CPU and the process need to put in the ready queue. Now, these time quantas are in the order of milliseconds. So, that is why this short term scheduler, it gets executed very frequently, which is in the order of milliseconds. Then there is this long term scheduler or the job scheduler. So, this long term scheduler actually helps to detect or to select the process that should be brought to the ready queue. Now, whenever you are running a system like a say for example, if you are executing a mixed mode of multitasking system with a multi-programming environment, that means you have multiple processors in your machine. During that time, what you have to do, that you have multiple jobs which are being waited, say think about a cloud environment or think about a mainframe computer. So, people or the users of the system are submitting the jobs there, and the purpose of the long term scheduler is to fetch the job from the job queue and put it to the ready queue. So, these long term scheduler are invoked infrequently in the order of seconds or minutes. So, that is why they may be slow. So, the long term scheduler, because it basically waits for empty space in the ready queue, say it has already fetched some of the jobs in the ready queue, and the jobs which are there or the process which are there in the ready queue, they are getting executed. Once the execution of a process gets completed and the process leaves the ready queue, during that time the long term scheduler or the job scheduler basically fetch the next process and put it to the ready queue. So, this long term scheduler, it basically controls the degree of multiprogramming. In the sense that, say, if you have multiple jobs which are waiting to get executed to, or if you are having multiple jobs which are waiting to get scheduled, then this long term scheduler actually helps you to decide that how many jobs you will fetch simultaneously and you will execute it in your system. So, that way it basically controls the degree of multiprogramming, that in what order you will execute the jobs in your system. So, the process that we execute in a system, we can have two broad type of classification of process. Either it can be a IO bound process. So, a IO bound process spends more time doing the input output operations than computation. So, it has many short CPU burst. So, it is something like that the process basically execute very little amount of operations inside the CPU and takes lots of time to get input from the users or showing the output. So, for that type of process we call it a kind of IO bound process. And the second type of process is the CPU bound process. The CPU bound process, they spend more time in doing the computation. That means they doesn't take, say for example, you are thinking about matrix multiplication of two large matrices. So, it is like that the input operation is a one time operation where you will take the two matrix as a input, and the output operation is again a one time operation where you will show the multiplication of that two matrix. But this metric computation, multiplication matrix multiplication computation, it takes significant amount of CPU resources. So, it need to do lots of computation in terms of multiplication and repeated addition. So, you know that a kind of matrix multiplication algorithm, if you apply a naive approach, it is a kind of order of n cube algorithm. So, it takes lots of CPU resources. So, that type of particular process we call it a kind of CPU bound process. Now, this long term scheduler, it strives for good process mix. That means that it tries to balance the number of parallel operations which are there in terms of IO bound process and CPU bound process. So, it should be something like that whenever some IO bound process is busy for doing the IO, during that time you can take a CPU bound process and apply the CPU or allocate the CPU to that particular process so that it can complete its computation. Then we have something called a medium term scheduler. It is not applicable for all type of operating system. Rather, this medium term scheduler is basically utilized in case of a mainframe computer or large scale data center or a cloud computing or this kind of server computing kind of environments, where you can add a medium term scheduler if you want to dynamically change the degree of multiprogramming. So, it is like that long term scheduler, it basically takes a job from the job queue and put it to the ready queue. Now, you found out that well this long term scheduler is taking the jobs very frequently, or there are jobs which are there in the ready queue which actually affects the degree of multiprogramming or the process scheduling performance. During that time, this medium term scheduler helps to remove the process from the memory. It stores those process in the disk and it bring back the process from the disk to continue the execution. So, we call this as a swapping procedure. So, later on we will discuss about this swap in and swap out kind of primitives which are basically used to transfer a program from the main memory to the secondary storage or the disk or vice versa. So, the task of the medium term scheduler is to do this kind of thing. So, if it finds out that well, if you take a process to the main memory, then the process is actually taking lots of resources and it is affecting the execution of other processes. During that time, the medium term scheduler can basically takes a partially executed process, and it can basically we call this process as swap out, and then it puts that process in the disk. Now once a partially executed process is in the disk or in the secondary storage, then again the medium term scheduler can find out that, well, now the resource availability in my system is more, that means the CPUs are remaining idle. During that time it can take back this partially executed process, swap out processes from the disk and again put it to the ready queue. So this way a medium term scheduler can help in managing the memory space that you have in your main memory. Now a little bit of things about this mobile system. So in a mobile system, most of the times we run a kind of multitasking environment, because this mobile system in general in most of the at least low to medium end mobile phones, we have a single processor. It may be multi-core processor, but in general it is a single processor. So we basically work on the principle of multitasking. So in some early version of the iOS and some early version of the Android, they only allow only one process to run, and they basically suspended other process. So you will see that, well, in your mobile phone what can be there, that there is a single foreground process which is currently being executed, and there can be multiple background process which are in memory running, but they are not on the display. So because your mobile phone has a limited display, so you cannot put multiple things side by side. So you have only one process which is in the foreground that you can see in the display, one application, and other applications are kind of background process. So in case of Android operating system, this Android operating system runs the foreground and background process with some limits, like the background process uses a service to perform the task. It runs like a service, background service. The services can keep running even if the background process is suspended, and the services has no user interfaces. So it uses very small amount of main memory. Okay. Now coming to the concept of context switch in terms of process scheduling. So the thing is that in case of a CPU, because I have a single CPU in, so we are considering a single CPU system. So you have multiple processes which you want to run on a single CPU in a multitasking environment. So during that time you have to basically switch between multiple processes. So you have to take a process from the ready queue, execute it in the CPU, then take back the process again to the ready queue, take another process in execution. So whenever you are switching from one process to another process and the previous process is not yet completed, during that time what you can do, then the system can do, the system can basically save the state of the system, because whenever you are switching from one process to another process and after some time you will switch back to the old process and start executing that process. So that means you have to save the state of the process. So in last class we have talked about this concept of process control block. So this process control block or the PCB, it basically stores or saves the state of a process. So state of a process means the state of the local variables, the state of the function calls, the state of the multiple pointer variables, which memory locations are being accessed. So all these particular states are stored in a local in a process control block, and this information is stored in memory. So that particular procedure is called a context switching. So context switching means you are basically storing the state of a old process in the process control block and then saving it for future use, and you are basically reading the process control block of a new process and restarting its execution. So that is the point. The context of a process is represented in the PCB. So this context switch time, it is actually a overhead for the process scheduler. Say if you are running a process which has lots of local variables or which has lots of memory states, then the PCB size also increases. So in such a scenario, you need to take a significant amount of time to store the content in the process control block. So that is why whenever you are switching the context of a process, or you are doing a context switching between multiple processes, then that comes as a overhead for your system. So for more complex operating system and the process control block, it takes longer time for the context switching. Now the time for context switching, it depends on the hardware support, that if you have some hardware which provides multiple sets of registers per CPU, that means you can load multiple contents simultaneously. So this register are the temporary variable which actually stores the local variable, the states of the variables and all these factors. So if you have a large number of registers which are associated with your CPU, during that time you can basically switch the context very fast. So that way the context switching time, it basically depends on the hardware support that you have. So if we look into the basic operations that are there on process, so operating system, it must provide the mechanism for creation of a new process, termination of a new process, and many other functionality which we will talk about one after another. So coming to the process creation, so this process creation works in a hierarchical fashion. So initially there is a parent process, that particular parent process, it can create multiple children processes. Those children processes can further create other children process. So it basically creates a kind of tree of processes. So if you look into the Linux operating system, so in case of a Linux based operating system, if you look at how the processes are being created, you will see that initially whenever you are boot up a Linux process, it create a initial process or the init process. Now that init process basically creates multiple child processes for different purposes. Say there would be process which is, say, your scheduler process, which actually schedule the jobs. Then there is some cron processes which run the background services. Then there can be some other processes for, say, memory management. Then there can be processes for say your network. So that way the init process, which is actually the process ID 0, it creates such multiple processes using this fork system call. We will talk about this fork system call, how this fork system call actually works, and then it creates such multiple child processes. Now say for example a child process, it again creates multiple other child processes. Say the scheduler process again can create multiple process, multiple child process which will handle different kind of scheduling activities. So they are again executing the fork system call to create the child process. That way this process block, it basically forms a tree type of architecture. Starting from the root of the tree, which is in general this init process in case of a Linux or any Unix based operating system. So every process, it is basically identified and managed via process identifier. So this process identifier actually helps in identifying the particular process. So for example, that I have said that for the init process in Linux operating system, the process ID is 0. It is the root process. Then whenever you are creating this multiple processes, you have limited amount of resources in your system. So the parent and child process all basically share the same amount of resources. So sometime it may happen that the child can share a subset of the parent resources, or it can actually use the complete resources that the parent have. Or another process can be that the parent and child, they are completely independent and they doesn't share any resource among themselves. And the execution options can be like the parent and children, sometimes they can execute concurrently. In that case, the scheduler have to schedule the parent process and the child process simultaneously based on multitasking or the multi-programming environment that you have. Or sometime it may happen that once a parent creates a child, the parent process actually depends on the output of the child process. So for example, say you are basically trying to implement a parallel merge sort algorithm where you are actually dividing your array, the whole array that are given to you, into multiple smaller chunks, and every individual process will sort the partial array, and the parent will basically combine the result. Now if this is your application, then the parent process will actually divide the input array into and then fork multiple child processes. The child processes will then get one part of this array, and they will do the local sorting on that part of array, and the parent will wait until the child does that local sorting. So once the child does the sorting on the part of array which is given to them, then the parent process resume the execution, and it can basically merge those partially sorted array to find out a completely sorted array. So in this kind of primitive, the parent basically waits until the child process or all its children terminate. So this is the things that I was discussing in case of a Linux operating system. The init process with process ID 1, or in some Unix based system it is taken as process ID 0. It forms the root of the process tree. Then it can create multiple process like login, kthread, then sshd with different process IDs. Then those processes can again fork multiple other child processes, and that way it basically creates a tree kind of architecture. Now if you look into the process creation, some of the other primitives of process creation, whenever this process is created, if you look into the address space that is allocated to the parent, the child is basically a duplicate of the parent initially. Now you can load a separate program to the child process after the child is created. So the idea is that once you are creating a child process, say this is your initial memory part which is being used by the parent process, and then you have execute a fork system call to create a child process. So in this scenario, the child process initially it will be a complete copy of this parent memory space. Now what you can do, you can basically use this exact system call to load another process in the child's memory. So the idea is that once you are executing the fork system call, the child process is created and the memory space is allocated to the child. So initially whatever be the content of the memory space for the parent process, that complete content will be copied to this memory space which is allocated to a child process. Then you can basically use this exact system call to load a different program inside the child memory space. In that case, the child memory space, the content of the child memory space will be different from the content of the parent's memory space. Okay. So that is the thing, that in case of a Unix based system, this fork system call, it creates a new child process, and the exact system call which is used after the fork call to replace the process memory space of the child with a new program. So this fork system call, it creates a child process, and the parent goes to the waiting state based on the way you are writing your code, and then you can use this exact system call to load a new process, new program inside the child's memory space. And once the child gets exit, then based on your primitive, you can resume the process of the parent, or sometime the parent or the child, they can also execute simultaneously. So this is a sample program, C program, which you can use to create a child process. So if you look into the main function, we have defined a process ID, which is a PID type of variable. So all these things are actually defined inside this header c/types.h. Then we are making a fork system call to create a child process, Now this fork system call returns the corresponding process ID. What the fork system call does, the fork system call creates a child process. Now you have two different process. In the parent process, it will basically return the ID of the child process. So it will allocate a new ID to the child process. In the parent process, it will return the ID of the child process, and in the child process, it will return process ID as 0. So it is like that. Whenever you are forking for a new system, new process, so if you look into this PID value from inside the parent process, you will see that it is a non-zero value. That means it is the process ID of the child process. If you look the PID at the child process, then that value will be a 0. Okay, so then by using this PID variable, you can actually determine whether you are inside the parent process or inside the child process. And remember what I have mentioned, that what a system basically does. So initially it keeps a complete copy of the program which is being executed in the parent process. So that means initially this is your program that you are executing inside your parent process. So the same copy of the program will get copied to the child program as well. So we use this concept, and then we check that if the process ID is less than 0, that means there is some kind of error, and we basically print a statement that the fork has failed. So it was not able to create any new child process, and we return some variable. Now if process ID equal to 0, process ID equal to 0 means you are inside the child process. So you are inside the child process, so you can use this exact group of system calls. So exec has multiple variants. So this is one variant of exec, which is exec LP. So here we are basically loading this ls program. So ls is a standard system program which actually shows, which actually prints the current content of a directory. So we load that particular program inside the child process. And if the value is greater than 0, that means you are inside the parent process. So what we are doing here, so we are making a wait statement with a parameter null. That means the parent will wait until the child execution gets completed. So once the child execution gets completed, the parent will come out from this wait system call, and then it will make a printf statement that the child is completed. So this is the a very simple program to create multiple processes using this fork system call, which is actually very useful for implement various type of system programs when you require multiple process creation and process handling. So again repeating the concept, so it is like that. Once you are making a fork system call, it is returning back you the process ID. Now you check the process ID. If the process ID is less than 0, that means some error has been happened. If the process ID is equal to 0, that means you are inside the child process, and if the process ID is greater than 0, then you are inside the parent process. So that is the whole idea. So initially the child process keeps a complete copy of the parent process. So the child process has the same code that you are running inside the parent process, and that is why you can call this particular primitive, like if PID equal to 0, and then you can call the exact group of function to execute a new program inside your child process. And remember, whenever you are making this exact system call, during that time the whole content, so initially the child process has the content similar to this program, then the child process, the content of the child process get replaced by this ls program. Next, coming to this process termination. Process termination is also an important concept. So process, they execute the last statement and then ask the operating system to delete it using the exit system call. So during that time it returns the status data from the child to parent via the wait system call. That means if the parent is in the waiting state, then the child send the signal to the parent process that the child execution got terminated, and the resource that were allocated to the particular child process, those are deallocated and taken back by the operating system. Then the parent, it may also terminate the execution of a children processes using this abort system call. So sometime we need to use this abort system call where the parent actually forcefully terminate a process, like the child has exceeded all allocated resources, the task assigned to child is no longer required, or the parent is exiting and the operating system does not allow a child to continue if the parent terminates. So this last point is an important point. In case of this process termination, what can happen that sometime it may happen that you have terminated a parent process, but you have not terminated a child process. So that means you in your parent process you have not called the waiting state, and the parent has completed its execution and it has terminated. So you did not invoke the wait system call inside the process. So the process actually terminates. So if a parent process terminates, then we call that process as a zombie process. And there can be another state like a orphan process. In case of orphan process, forcefully terminated the parent process, and during that particular process cases, the children processes, they become a kind of orphan process. So you have some parent process, the parent process has created multiple child processes. Now it may happen that the inside the parent process you have a wait system call. Okay. So whenever inside the parent process you have a wait system call, so the parent is basically waiting for the child to complete. Okay. Then the parent will actually take back the resource which are there for the child, and they will continue their execution. Now assume that some system error has happened and the parent got suddenly terminated. If that is the case, that means the childs are still executing, but the child will not be able to send the signal to the the child will not be able to send the signal to the parent process. So this signaling mechanism will not work. So in that case, what will happen? So the child will not be able to terminate because it is trying to send the signal to the parent, but the parent has suddenly terminated because of some kind of system error. So this particular case is the parent has terminated due to some system error. So the child is trying to send the signal, but it is not able to send that signal to the parent. So the child is keep on trying doing that. So this kind of process we call them like a zombie process. So this zombie process are kind of shortcoming or a kind of problem for the operating system, because what happens that if you have a zombie process, the child will only be able to release the resources. So the child processes has taken some resources and they are basically continuing their execution. Now they will send, once the execution is completed, they will send the signal back to the parent and then they will release the resources. Now if the parent suddenly gets terminated, then the child will not be able to release those resources because they are not be able to send that termination signal to the parent. So that way the child becomes zombie process. Zombie process means they have taken some resources, but they are not able to release those resources. So those particular resources becomes unusable. So we do not want the zombie process in our system. And another process is a kind of orphan process. The orphan process is something like that. In this case, in case of this parent-child relationship, we are considering that the execution of the parent depends on the execution of the child. Now another case is that say for example the code that I have shown to you for the fork system call, in that particular case the parents and the childs, they are a separate process, they doesn't depend on each other. Like the parent, there is that wait system call. So consider a scenario where inside parent you are executing something and the parent is not waiting for the child to be terminated. and the childs are executing something else. Now in that particular case, what can happen? The parent can independently stop their execution, and the child, they independently stop their execution. Now when the parent terminates, during that time the child doesn't have a parent. So we call those children processes as the orphan processes. So I guess the difference between the zombie process and the orphan processes are clear to you. So in case of a zombie process, the child is basically waiting for the parent process, but the parent has been terminated forcefully. So the childs are not able to release the resource. That's why we call it as a zombie process. In case of a orphan process, the parent execution and the child execution are independent, and that is why the parent has, say, assumed that the parent has executed first. So it has completed its execution and it has terminated. Now the children are executing independently, and by the time parent has completed that execution and parent has terminated, the child have not completed their execution. So under that scenario, the child doesn't have a parent, and we call those children processes as orphan processes. Okay, one example of this multiprocess architecture is the Chrome browser, where you have multiple processes like the browser process which manage the user interface. You have renderer process which actually render the web pages, deals with HTML, JavaScript. Then you can have multiple plugin processes, say in Chrome browser, multiple processes, multiple plugins installed, and that plugins are doing their job. So that can be a separate process. Now in modern browser, you can have multiple such tabs. Now each tab is actually a separate process. So that way the application, this Chrome application, it is basically a kind of multiprocess architecture. So it creates, whenever you are opening a new tab, it is creating a new process. Now there is one issue regarding this inter-process communication. When there are multiple processes, as we have talked about this memory architecture, and what happens that whenever you are creating multiple processes, this memory location, this stack memory and the heap memory for different processes are different. So the stack and heap memory for the parent process is different for what is there for the child process. So that way, if you declare a variable inside the say stack, so the stack memory space which actually stores the local variable, if you declare a local variable inside the parent, the local variable may not get replicated to the child process. So for example, if you declare a local variable, say, let me just show an example. Say assume that you have declared a variable int I equal to 0, then you have created a fork system call to create a child process. After that, if you are making if PID equal to 0, then I equal to say I plus 1, else if PID greater than 0, I equal to I minus 1. Now what happens here? Say whenever you are declaring this local variable and making a system call, so this part is your child process and this part is your parent process. Now this child process and the parent process, they will get complete different copy of this local variable I. So do not assume that this parent process and this child process, they are working on the same copy of the variable I. So this child process, it will independently increase the variable, and the parent process, it will independently decrease the variable. So if you make a printf statement inside the child process, you will see that the value of I is equal to 1, and if you make a printf statement inside the parent process, you will see that the value of I is equal to minus 1. So they are basically independent. Now I is not a shared variable between the child and the process, because the stack variable, the stack memory space that is there, it is completely different for the parent and child. So this is say the stack memory space, and this is for the memory space for the parent and this is the memory space for the child. Now parent and child will have a completely different instance of this local variable I. So the child will copy the code that the parent have, but the parent has the value of I as 0 and the child has the value of I as 0. Now the parent will increment it separately, child will increment it separately and the parent will decrement it separately. So there is no relation between these two i's. They are completely two separate instances of the local variable I. Now assume that in some cases you want that some variables are being shared between the parent and child. So say for example in case of a file handling, you want that both the parent and the child should handle the same file. So that way if you want to make a communication between the parent and the child, you should have some mechanism of inter-process communication or IPC mechanism. So there are basically two models of IPCs which are used by the operating system. One is called the shared memory architecture. In case of a shared memory architecture, we basically define a common memory space which is being shared by both the parent and the child, and the second primitive is the message passing. So there is something called the pipe, concept of a pipe. Using the concept of a pipe, you can send a message from a parent to child to make them communicate with each other, or you can basically not only from parent to child, rather between any two processes. So this is the concept of message passing. In case of a message passing, you have a common message queue. Now this process access this message queue to read the message. Another process can also access the message queue to write into the message queue. So this process is passing some message to the message queue and this process is fetching that message from the message queue, and vice versa, both sides are true. And the second is the shared memory primitive. In case of a shared memory primitive, you have a memory space which is being shared by both process A and process B. So in C programming, in standard ANSI C programming, we have functions which can be utilized to define both the shared memory and the message passing interface. So as we have mentioned, there can be two type of process: the independent process where the execution of the processes are independent of each other, and there can be kind of cooperating process where the process basically cooperate with each other for execution. Say for example, a cooperative process execution is this producer consumer problem. So you have a common data buffer. In the common data buffer, the producers are producing something and they are putting it to the buffer and the consumer are consuming that thing from the buffer. So this is a kind of example of a cooperative process. Obviously, if the buffer is full, that means the consumer are not consuming anything. There is no consumer in the system. If that is the case, then the producer cannot produce further content until there becomes space in the data buffer. Similarly, if the buffer is empty, that means there is no producer, then the consumer cannot consume anything. So that way, this is a kind of model for this cooperating process. So we'll talk about all these things later on. There can be two model of this kind of problem, like a unbounded buffer problem. That means there is no practical limit on the buffer, and there is a bounded buffer problem where there are some limits on the buffer. So we have already discussed this shared memory architecture and the message passing architecture. I am just skipping this part because of the timing constraint. So you can read these stuffs, and if you have any doubt, you are always free to drop me an email. Now coming to the basic concepts of this process scheduling. So in general, what happens that a process basically have repeated CPU burst and the IO burst. So that means a process basically say load and store something, read from the file, and that is a kind of CPU operation. They need to wait for some amount of IO, which is the IO burst. They need increment the index variable, which is again a kind of CPU operation. Then again it can wait for IO, and then it can execute the load and store operation to read and write data from a file. It is again a CPU intensive CPU operation. So that way a process can have repeated cycle of CPU burst and the IO burst. What we have to ensure that whenever a process is within the IO burst, that means it is waiting for the IO operation, during that time you have to actually or what you can do, if there are some other process which are waiting there in the ready queue, you can fetch that process, and that particular process can use the CPU resources to complete their execution. So that way you can pipeline the CPU burst and the IO burst for multiple process, and that is the basic task of a process scheduler. So we have already discussed the concept of the CPU scheduler or a short-term scheduler. The CPU scheduling decision, it can switch a process from a running state to a waiting state. It can switches a process from the running state to the ready state. So it switches it from running state to waiting state in case there is a wait for IO. It switches from the running state to ready state if the process gets some interrupt. Then it can switch a process from waiting state to a ready state, like when the IO gets completed, or it can terminate the process. Now there can be two mode of operation. One we called as a non-preemptive mode of operation, and the second is the preemptive mode of operation. So in case of non-preemptive mode of operation, it is like that you are not explicitly preempting the process from execution. So for example, let us first clear about what is mean by preemptive scheduling, then the non-preemptive primitive will be clear to you. In case of a preemptive scheduling, say consider a case of an interrupt. So for example, you are running a process, and during that time you are sending some interrupt from your keyboard, like you are pressing a Control C or a Control Z. It can be based on whether you are pressing Control C or Control Z. It can be a software interrupt or a hardware interrupt. Now whenever you are sending such kind of interrupt, the process need to be, the current process need to be stopped. And there can be other type of interrupts as well, but the basic philosophy is when an interrupt is being received, then the current execution of the process need to be stopped, and another process, it can be a second process or a interrupt service routine, that need to be executed in the CPU. So under such kind of scenario, what you have to do, you have to make a context switch between, or better to say, you have to make a forceful context switch between two processes. So this kind of scheduling algorithm, we call it as a preemptive scheduling. So we'll discuss about different kind of preemptive scheduling in details. And the other case is the non-preemptive mode, where you are not forcibly stopping a running process. It may happen that because of some IO request, the process moves from ready state to the waiting state. So for example, this first primitive, it is a non-preemptive primitive. When the process moves from the running state to the waiting state, and you are basically utilizing that amount of time to basically handle or utilize the CPU resource for executing another processes. So these are kind of non-preemptive mode of. So there is a concept called dispatcher. So this dispatcher module, it gives control of the CPU to the process selected by the short-term scheduler. So this involves switching the context, then switching to the user mode, and then jumping to the proper location in the user program and restart the program. So you have basically making a context switching. Context switching means you are storing the content of the current process inside the process control block and storing it in the memory space. Then you are loading the process control block of the new process, and then you are moving to the user mode, reading the process control block for the new process, and start execution of the process from where it stopped earlier. So that particular task are basically done by a dispatcher, and the time it takes to stop one process and start another process running, that particular time we call as a dispatch latency. So while we will discuss about different type of scheduling algorithm, we will look into different properties or different parameters to analyze the performance of various scheduling algorithm. One is the CPU utilization. CPU utilization is keep the CPU as busy as possible, that we want to do. So we want to find out what percentage of time the CPU is being utilized. Then we want to compute the throughput, that the number of processes that complete their execution per time unit, say per second or per minute. Then the turnaround time, it is the amount of time to execute a particular process. You will see that it is not always the time duration of the process, because the turnaround time is it may happen that a process has executed up to some point, then you have a context switch. That means it is say waiting for a IO or some interrupt happen. The process again migrated to the ready queue, and again after some time you have started re-executing the process. So during that time, so this turnaround time actually contains the total time that have been taken to execute a particular process. Then the waiting time, the amount of time a process has been waiting in the ready queue. Then the response time, the amount of time it takes from when a request was initially submitted until the first response is produced. So remember, it is like the first response is produced, not the final output. So it is like that, a process comes to the ready queue, and then starting from that point of time, the first time you have taken a process, and then you have started executing it. So let me just explain these parameters. Say assume that we are processes one after another, and we draw them in the form of a chart which we call as a Gantt chart. We will come to this concept. So assume that we have two processes running, P1 and P2. So P1 is getting executed for say 3 seconds, then P2 is getting executed say from 3 seconds to 8 seconds, then again P1 gets executed for 8 seconds to 9 seconds, then again say P2 gets executed from 9 seconds to 10 seconds, then P3 gets say P2 gets, sorry, not P2, say P1 gets executed from 10 seconds to 11 seconds. Now if you look into the parameters, the first parameter was the turnaround time. So the turnaround time for P1, it will be P1 was first brought to the system to time 0, and it completes its execution at time 11. So the turnaround time from P1 is 11 seconds. Assume that both the process was available at time instance 0. So at time instance 0, both the process were there in the ready queue. Then for P2, P2 was started, P2 was there in the ready queue at time 0, and its execution get completed at time second 10. So the turnaround time from P2 is 10 seconds. Now if you look into the waiting time, how much time the individual processes waits in the ready queue. So if you look into P1, see when P1 is not being executed, during that time it was waiting in the ready queue. So this time instance from 3 to 8, P1 was there in the ready queue. So this 5 second, for this 5 second duration, P was in the ready queue. Then from 9 to 10, this 1 second duration, P was there in the ready queue. So it is 6 seconds. Then for P2, P2 is the ready queue when P1 is executing. Say from 0 to 3, this for this time duration, P2 was there in the ready queue. So 3 plus then from 8 to 9 seconds, for this 1 second, P2 was there in the ready queue. So 1 second. Then its execution gets completed here. So it is 4 seconds. And then we call the third parameter, which is the response time. Response time means when the first response was produced. Now for P1, the first response was at time instance 0. So response time for P1 is 0 second. For P2, it is when the first response was produced. The first response was produced at time instance 3. So it is 3 seconds. So these are the three important parameters based on which we basically find out the performance of different scheduling algorithms. So in case of a normal scheduling algorithm, we basically want to maximize the CPU utilization, maximize the throughput. minimize the turnaround time, minimize the waiting time, and minimize the response time. So a good scheduling algorithm is one which basically maximize the CPU utilization and throughput and minimizes the turnaround time, waiting time, and response time. So before taking the leap, so we are discussing about different type of scheduling algorithm. So here we will start with this first come first serve or FC type of scheduling algorithm, which is the most simple type of scheduling algorithm used in the operating system. So the basic idea behind this first come first serve or FCFS scheduling is that the process which comes first, you first take that process and allocate the CPU resource for that particular process. Now in FCFS scheduling, as usual, it is a kind of non-preemptive scheduling because we are not preempting a process. Once a process is allocated, it completes its CPU burst and then leave the scheduler. So for example, here we have three processes P1, P2 and P3. P1 has a CPU burst duration of 24 seconds, P2 has 3 seconds and P3 has 3 seconds. Now assume that the process comes in the order of P1, P2, P3. So if you look into the Gantt chart, so P1 is scheduled first, then P2 is scheduled, then P3 is scheduled based on their order of arrival. Now in this scenario, you will see that the waiting time for P1 is 0, the waiting time for P2 is 24 and the waiting time for P3 is 27. So if we find out the average waiting time comes to be 70. Now let us look into a different scenario. Assume that the process arrives in the order of P2, P2, P3 and P1. If the process arrives in this order, then if you compute the waiting time for individual process, here you will see that the waiting time for P1 is 6, then the waiting time for P2 is 0, the waiting time for P3 is 3. So the average waiting time comes to be 3. So this is kind of a much better than the previous one because as we have mentioned, we want to minimize the waiting time for a better scheduling algorithm. So clearly what you can see that the scheduling is basically dependent on the order of in the order the process arrives in the system. And the performance is solely depend on that. So it is not a kind of good scheduling algorithm, and we have something called a convoy effect. Convoy effect means the short process, they are basically behind the long process. So first you are getting a long process, then you are getting multiple short process, because of which the short process will have a higher waiting time and which actually increase the overall waiting time of the system. The example that I have we have discussed. So in the previous case, whenever the process comes in the order of P1, P2, P3, the short processes are behind the long process, then we have a higher average waiting time of 17. But in the other scenario, when we assume that the process comes in the order of P2, P3 and P1, here the long process is executed later and the short processes are executed first, so we have a much better waiting time. This is the shortest job first scheduling algorithm. Shortest job first scheduling algorithm in this particular scheduling algorithm, which is indeed the optimal scheduling algorithm in terms of different performance parameter. So here we associate with each process the length of its next CPU burst. So we use this length to schedule the process with the shortest time. So if you look into the FCFS scheduling, in the FCFS scheduling, if you know that these processes P2 and P3 has a shorter burst time compared to a process P1, then you can schedule P2 and P3 first and then you can schedule P1. And that is basically the idea behind the shortage of first scheduling. In case of shortage of first scheduling, you assume that you know the CPU burst duration and then based on that you schedule the process. Yeah. But the question is that although it gives the optimal result, but the question is that how will you basically estimate the duration of a CPU burst? Because once a process start execution and completes its CPU burst duration, then only you come to know that, well, this process has executed inside CPU for 24 seconds. But beforehand, even before the process start execution, how can you estimate this how can you estimate this CPU burst a priori? So here is an example of shortage job first. So we have 4 processes P1, P2, P3, P4, and they have the burst duration of 6, 8, 7, 3. Assume that at the beginning all the processes were there in the ready queue. So if you look into the Gantt chart for SGF scheduling, shortage job first scheduling, P4 has the minimum burst duration of 3. So we first take P4. Then it is P1. So we take P1, which is 6 seconds. Then we take P3, which is 7 seconds, and then we take P2, which is the longest duration at the end, that is 8 seconds. Now in this way, if you compute the average waiting time, the average waiting time comes to be 7 seconds. So the question remains that how will you determine the length of the next CPU burst before the process is actually getting executed. So in such a scenario, we can only estimate the length. The idea is that the length. So if you remember that a process basically have periodic execution of CPU burst and the IO burst. So if you look the scenario, a process has a duration of CPU burst, say for some duration, then it has an IO burst for say some duration, then again it has the next CPU burst for some duration, then again IO, CPU. So this is the first CPU burst, this is the second CPU burst, and this is the third CPU burst. So idea is here that if we know the previous CPU burst, then from this previous CPU burst we can estimate the next CPU burst in a approximated way. So how can we do that? For that we use something like a weighted approximation mechanism. So this is the algorithm for that. Say assume that Tn is the actual length of the end CPU burst and tau n plus 1 is the predicted value for the next CPU burst. Then tau n plus 1 will be equal to alpha Tn plus 1 minus alpha into tau n. So tau n was the earlier estimation of the end CPU burst, and then based on we are giving some weight to the previous burst, actual burst that we have observed at end CPU burst, and the estimation that we have done at the end CPU burst. So in general, we give equal weightage to both actual observation and the estimation, and this particular thing we call is as a shortest remaining time first scheduling. So this is a mechanism where we basically do the estimation. So we have the consecutive actual CPU burst and the guess. So initially say the guess is 10, and then we observe that the value is 6, and we are taking the value alpha as half. The next guess would be the previous guess and the corresponding observation. The previous guess was 10, so 0.5 into 10 plus 0.5 into 6, which comes to be 8. Now this 8 was the actual thing, and we observe that it is actually 4 seconds. Then we again do the same thing, 0.5 into 8 plus 0.5 into 4, that means 4 plus 2 equal to 6. Then we observe that the actual value is 6. So again we do a average, it comes to be 6. Then we see the actual value is 4. So again it comes to be half of 6, that is 3, plus half of 4, that is 2, 3 plus 2, 5. And that way we do the estimation of this CPU burst at consecutive rounds. So based on what we estimated previously and what we observed. Now in case of this exponential averaging, if you set alpha equal to 0, there actually we are not counting the recent history. The complete weight is given on the estimation. Similarly, if you take alpha equal to 1, you actually consider the last CPU burst. So we want something balance between these two. So here is an example of the shortest remaining time first scheduling algorithm. So assume that there are 4 processes and these are their arrival time, and these are the corresponding burst time, the estimated burst time. Then in case of the preemptive version, so we have earlier discussed that there can be two versions, preemptive and non-preemptive. In case of preemptive, what will happen that after a process finishes partial execution, if we see that there is a better option, we preempt that particular process, makes a context switch and takes the new process. Let us see it with an example. So at time 0, you have only P1 in the system. So we start with P1. Now we execute P1 for 1 second, P2 arrives. Now once P2 arrives, you will see that the burst time, the estimated burst time for P2 is less than P1. That means we should now select P2. Here a context switch basically occurs and we basically preempt P1 and start execution for P2. So P1 is preempted, P1 is put in the ready queue. We start execution for P2 from starting from 1. So we execute it, say at 2 seconds P3 comes, it has a higher burst time than P2. At 3 seconds P4 comes, it again has a higher burst time than P2. So we continue the execution of P2 and P2 completes, P2 has a burst duration of 4 seconds. So P2 completes its execution at 5th second. Then we take the minimum one. Now P2 gets completed. Out of the rest 3, P1, P3 and P4, P4 is the minimum. So we take P4. So once P4 gets completed, we again see that now in between P3 and P1, P1 has the minimum. So we take P1 here. But you remember that P1 has already executed the first 1 second, completed the first 1 second of its execution. So the remaining time for P1 is now 7. So it continues to execute for 7 more seconds. So here actually you see the need for process control block or PCB comes into place. So once we preempt the scheduler, once we preempt the process P1 at 1 second, then the dispatcher actually stored the state of P1 inside process control block, and at this 10 second when we again resume the execution of P1, during that time the dispatcher takes P1 back, reads the process control block, reads the state variable and restart the execution from that using that initial state variables. Now if you compute the average waiting time, the average waiting time comes to be 6.5 milliseconds. So if you take this in the order of millisecond, it comes to be 6.5 millisecond as average waiting. So next we look into another type of scheduling, which is called a priority scheduling algorithm. So in case of priority scheduling, we assign a priority with each process. So priority scheduling can be preemptive as well as non-preemptive. So in case of a preemptive priority scheduling, if a higher priority process comes, you then preempt the low priority process, move it to the ready queue and start the higher priority process. In case of non-preemptive process, you do not preempt the current process which is in execution. Rather, you complete the execution of that process and then take the process which is of lowest priority among all the processes which are there in the ready queue. So in case of priority scheduling, you can have a process of problem of starvation. Starvation in the sense what can happen that say a high priority process comes. Once a high priority process comes, but before the high priority process comes execution, you can get multiple low priority process. Just the reverse, if you have a low priority process, the low priority process is there in the waiting queue and then you are continuously getting some high priority process. In that case, the high priority processes will be selected first and they will get executed, but the low priority process, it will keep on waiting in the ready queue. We call this kind of scenario as starvation. And the possible solution for starvation is apply this aging mechanism. So aging mechanism is that as time progresses, you basically gradually increase the priority of a process. So initially the priority of the process is low, but as it wait in the ready queue, you gradually increase its priority. So here is an example of the priority scheduling. So you take the low priority process P2, which is a so here we actually assume that a process with low value in priority, it is actually the highest priority. So priority is actually in the reverse order of this number. So 1 is the process with maximum priority. Then 2 is the next process which has the second maximum priority. So what you do that you take process P2 first, then execute it, then process PF first. Once process, so that way you schedule it one after another. Then we have multiple other scheduling algorithm like this round robin scheduling algorithm. The round robin scheduling algorithm, we have a fixed time quanta, and with that time quanta you basically switch from one process to another. So I am directly going to the example. So assume that you have three processes P1, P2, P3, and these are their burst time. So assume that the time quanta is 4. So if time quanta is 4, then you first schedule P1. P1 will execute for 4 seconds, then P2 comes. But P2 gets a duration for 4 seconds to execute, but P2 has a duration of 3 seconds, so it executes for 3 seconds. Then comes P3. P3 again executes for 3 seconds. Then again you take P1. P1 execute for next 4 seconds. After that there are no other process, so P1 will continue its execution for the remaining time quanta. So there is a duration, there is a trade-off in case of round robin scheduling. There is a trade-off between this time quantum and the context switches. So if you have a, say a process duration is 10, if you take time quantum as 12, then you do not have a context switch. Context switch means you do not need to break the process. If you consider time quantum as 6, then you can have one break. So that means one context switch. If you consider time quantum as 1, then you can have 9 such context switches. So that way, and as we have discussed earlier, that context switch has some overhead. Like whenever you are doing a context switch, you have to actually store the state of the variable in a process control block and then restart the another process again. And for the new process, you have to load the process control block again. So that way, context switch has significant overhead. So there is basically a trade-off between your choice of time quantum and your choice of context switch. Then there are some kind of scheduling which are practically utilized in case of our modern operating system like this Linux operating system. It uses this multi-level queue scheduling. So multi-level queue scheduling is something like this. You have multiple queues, like the system processes are in one queue, then the interactive processes is one queue, interactive editing process is another queue, the batch process is another queue, the student process or the user process is another queue. Then individual queues have their priority, and then for individual queues you can apply different scheduling algorithms. So for example, for the system process, maybe you can apply a priority scheduling algorithm, but for the student process or the low priority process, you may apply some kind of round robin scheduling algorithm. So that way, for different classes of process or different groups of processes, you can apply different scheduling algorithm. So that actually happens in case of our Linux or Unix based operating system. So that was a question in the last class, that what scheduling algorithm our Unix operating system or Linux based operating system actually run. So this is the particular scheduling algorithm. They doesn't run a fixed scheduling algorithm, rather they run different scheduling algorithm for different types of process. So this is all about this process scheduling algorithm. So in the process scheduling algorithm, we broadly discussed different aspects of process scheduling, and we have talked of different type of scheduling algorithm. So as we have to cover lots of things within a limited time duration of 6 hours, so I have skipped many of the details of this process scheduling. So you can actually read the books, and if you have any doubt, you are always free to drop me an email. Obviously, I will try to respond as early as possible. So the broad learning that is from the process scheduling algorithm is that there is some kind of scheduler which is there as a part of the operating system, and the task of that scheduler is to ensure your multitasking, to support the multitasking environment and the multi-programming environment. So it is like that you have multiple process, multiple applications which you are running there, and the scheduler, it basically selects one process based on the nature of the process, whether it is a CPU bound process or whether it is IO bound process, and based on that it execute that particular process inside your CPU. So that is all about this process scheduling algorithm. Next we will go to another aspect of this process management, which is again important for inter-process communication context. So as we have discussed earlier, that you can have two scenarios. You can have individual, or you can have processes which does not interact with each other. They are independent process. And another scenario can be like you have a cooperating process. So here in this topic of process synchronization, we will basically look into what happens when you have such kind of cooperating process. So clearly, when you have this cooperating process, basically multiple processes, they are working or they are trying to access some common resources. So the process, they can execute concurrently. They may be interrupted at any time, partially completing the execution. Now for this concurrent access of shared data, it becomes a problem sometimes. Say you assume a simple scenario where multiple processes are going to access a file. So you assume a scenario when a process is actually, when one process is writing something in the file and another process is reading from that particular file. Now when one process is writing in the file, during that time, if another process start reading from that file, the process will not get the updated content. On the other hand, the scenario or the system becomes more complicated if two persons or two processes are going to write on the same file. If that is the scenario, then what may happen, that both the processes are going to write on the same file, and they will their individual writing will get interlinked. So you will not get something meaningful out of that file. So that reason we need to ensure this kind of process synchronization. So the basic idea behind process synchronization is that you ensure the synchronization among multiple processes. So you can take a example of the producer consumer problem that we were discussing earlier. So the producer are producing something. So it is in an infinite loop. We are maintaining a counter. So when counter is equal to buffer size, we are not doing anything. That means the producer is waiting for getting the data consumed from the buffer, because the producer will not be able to produce anything because the buffer is full. So if they produce anything, there will be drop from the buffer. And then if that is not the case, that means if counter is less than buffer size, counter basically keeps track of how many elements are there in the buffer. If the counter is less than buffer size, then the producer basically produce the next element and increment the counter value. So that is the producer code. And then there is the consumer code. The consumer code also runs in an infinite loop. The consumer code, if the consumer, again this counter value basically keeps track of how many content are there inside your shared buffer, and if the counter is 0, that means there is nothing inside the buffer. And if that is the case, then the consumer cannot consume anything. In the other cases, the consumers basically consume the element from the buffer, so it is a, you can think of it is a kind of FIFO queue, first in first out queue. So the consumer consumes from the head of the buffer, head of the queue, whereas the producer put the element at the end of the queue. So the consumer takes the data out of the queue and it decrements the counter value. Now assume that this producer and consumer problem, they are basically running simultaneously. They are two concurrent processes, and there is a shared buffer which is being implemented as a shared variable. So we have discussed this concept of shared variable earlier. So it has been implemented in the form of a shared variable, and then this producer and the consumer process, the producer process is producing the content, putting it in the buffer, and the consumer process, it is consuming the things from the buffer. Now if you look into this counter variable, which is basically a shared variable, again a shared variable between the producer process and the consumer process. So the producer process, it increments the counter variable while it produces a new item, whereas the consumer process decrement the counter variable when it gets the data from the shared buffer. Now if you look how this counter variable is actually implemented, you will see that it is implemented in the form of a register using a temporary register. So the value of the counter is fetched from the memory, it is put in the register, then the register value is incremented, then again the content of the register is put in the counter. In case of decrementing, the same thing happens with a different operation. Again the counter value is read from the memory and it is put in a register. Then the register value is decremented and the counter value is stored inside and the register value, the updated register value is stored inside the counter variable in the memory. Now if these two values gets overlap, that means the producer thread and the consumer thread, or the producer process and the consumer process, they are executing these two things simultaneously. Then what may happen, say the producer execute register OR equal to counter 1, say initially say the count value is 5. So the producer executes this first statement, so the register value is 5. Then it increments the variable, then the register value becomes 6. Then the second consumer process, the consumer process read the value to register 2, so the register 2 now becomes 5. It decrements the value, so the register 2 value now becomes 4. Now assume that the producer execute the counter value as register 1, now the counter value becomes 6, whereas the counter value when the consumer write back the value from register 2 to the counter value, down the counter value becomes 4. Now you see that this is not the intended value. So initially the count value is 5. So the producer has produced something, a single element. The consumer has consumed a single element. So effectively the register value should be, or the counter value should be, the final counter value should be same. The counter value should be 5. But here we are seeing that the counter value has become 4. And why the problem is there? Because both the producer and the consumer, they have read the old value of the counter. So when the producer has produced a new item, that updated value is not being stored in the register 2. The old value is being stored in the register 2. So this kind of problem can occur in such kind of scenario, which is called as a race condition. Now to eliminate race condition, we do something like a critical section problem. So consider a system of n processes P0 to Pn minus 1. Each process has some critical section segment of code. So critical section means whatever be there inside the critical section, the whole block of code need to be executed at once. So whenever a process is accessing a critical section, some other process should not access the same critical section. So in case of a producer consumer problem, when the producer is accessing the counter variable, the consumer should not access the counter variable. So the consumer should only access the counter variable when producer is not accessing it. So this is something like an example of a critical section in an infinite loop. So the process enters, then it has a critical section, then it exits from the critical section and it executes rest of the section. Now whenever the process is inside the critical section, then we have to actually log this part so that no other process can actually execute this critical section component. So if you look into the algorithm for a process Pi as an example, in that case we have a while loop. Say when it is the turn of a process J, it is inside the critical section, then we set the variable turn to J and execute the remainder section. Now to solve this critical section problem, we have to ensure three conditions. First is called the mutual exclusion. So in case of mutual exclusion, if process Pi is executing in its critical section, then no other process can be executed in their critical section. So mutual exclusion basically ensures that only one process should execute the critical section at a time instant. Say for example, when the producer process is accessing the counter variable, the consumer process should not execute the counter variable. Then there is the concept of progress. The progress is that if no process is executing its critical section and there exists some process that wish to enter their critical section, then the section of the processes that will enter the critical section next cannot be postponed indefinitely. That means that if some other process which are waiting to get access to the critical section and currently no process is executing the critical section, then we should select one of the process which are waiting to get access to the critical section and they should access the critical section. So there should not be some kind of indefinite waiting, which is basically the third condition. There should be something like a bounded waiting. So every process in the system should get access to the critical section within some time duration. So that should not be the time duration to access a critical section should not be infinite. So there can be two approaches depending on this critical section handling, again the preemptive and the non-preemptive scenario. In case of a preemptive scenario, what may happen that once a process is executing a critical section and some interrupts come, we immediately leave the critical section and have other process gets hold of that particular section. So in case of a preemptive context switching of preemptive handling of critical section, you have to take special care about saving the context. And in case of non-preemptive, the thing is straightforward, that whenever a process is executing its critical section, then no other process should get access. Now there are multiple ways of handling this critical section problem. There is something called the Peterson solution. There is this synchronization hardware, special hardware support to handle the critical section, which actually provides some method of locking. So these basic methods I am skipping for the interest of time, and so there is this synchronization hardware and the Peterson solution which I am skipping, and I am directly going to the concept of semaphore, which is mostly used in most of our modern operating system to handle the critical section problem. Now what is a semaphore? A semaphore is basically a synchronization tool that provides a sophisticated way of process synchronization process to synchronize their activities. So a semaphore is basically, we term it as a variable s, which is an integer variable, and can only be accessed via two atomic operation. Atomic operation means whenever those operations are being executed, then the complete operations need to be executed. Say there are two operations like wait and signal which can be there on a semaphore. So sometime we call the wait as P, we term it as a process P or operation P, and the signal we term it as a operation V. Now this is the definition for the wait and the system wait and the signal operation on a semaphore. So in wait operation, so as you have mentioned, both this wait operation and the signal operation, they are kind of atomic operation. Atomic operation in the sense, whenever some process is executing this wait operation inside the semaphore, the whole wait operation need to be executed. So we ensure there is some kind of other primitives like a hardware support which makes this wait operation as a atomic operation. So if someone start executing the wait operation, it should complete the wait operation. So inside the wait operation, it basically looks into the value of s. If the value of s is less than equal to 0, it keep on waiting there. Okay. So once the value of s becomes greater than 0, then it decrement s and keeps out of this wait function. In case of signal operation, the signal operation simply increment the value of s, and as you have mentioned, s is a integer variable. So s is a integer variable means that this wait operation, it basically keeps on waiting on the value of s when the value of s is less than equal to 0, and then when it becomes non-zero, then it decrement the value of s, come out of this wait operation. In case of signal operation, it simply increment the value of. Now based on what can be the value of s, we can have two variant of semaphore. One is called the counting semaphore, where the value of s can be any integer value, and there can be something like a binary semaphore where the value of s can be either 0 or 1. So it means that only one process can execute that particular critical section at a time. So we sometimes call it as a mutex law. So let us directly go to an example about how we can use semaphore to solve some typical synchronization problem. So there are multiple aspects of how will you actually implement a semaphore in operating system. So if you look into the definition of a semaphore, you will see that this while loop is a busy waiting state. Busy waiting state means the process is actually executing something, but it is not doing any task. So it is just checking the value of s for indefinite time until the value of s becomes more than 0. So we call this as a kind of busy waiting, because ultimately the process has to at least execute or a checking whether the value of S becomes greater than 0. So we call this kind of waiting scenario as a busy waiting. So busy waiting means the process is not doing, but it is still taking some amount of CPU resources. So if you look into here, that process is actually checking this condition. To check that condition, it requires some amount of CPU resource. So we call this kind of waiting as a kind of busy waiting. Although it is waiting, but it still requires some amount of resource from the CPU, particular wait. So to make efficient implementation, we basically use some kind of list to implement the semaphore to avoid the busy waiting scenario. So I am not going to that details. You can read the Galvin book to go get the details of that. So I am directly. So this is an implementation with no busy waiting, where we implement semaphore as a list, as a dynamic. So let us take this bounded buffer problem, producer consumer problem, as an example of process synchronization, where there is a producer problem, there is a consumer problem, and you have a limited buffer. Then we consider that the size of the buffer is n, place of the buffer can hold one item, and we define 3 semaphore here. One is called the mutex. So the value of mutex is a binary semaphore, and it is initialized to the value 1. Then there is a semaphore full. So these two are basically counting semaphore, full and empty. So initially full is initialized to 0 and empty is initialized to value n. Now this is the structure of the producer process. So you first make a wait call on the empty semaphore. Now initially the value is n. So the value is n. Initially if you look into the wait, if you remember the structure of wait function, the wait function basically waits for have a infinite while loop, has a finite while loop until the value of the semaphore is less than equal to 0. So initially when the queue is empty there are some element in the queue, then this value of wait will be that the value of empty semaphore will be more than equal to 0. So if it is more than equal to 0, it is directly coming to the mutex semaphore, and this mutex semaphore basically ensuring or trying to find out whether the critical section that we have. So here the critical section is that we are producing some next item and adding it to the buffer. So when a producer is producing the next item, adding it to the buffer and increment the counter variable, then no other producer or no other consumer should execute that particular scenario. So this mutex is a semaphore, binary semaphore. So initially this mutex is initialized to the value 1. So that means the producer can enter here, one producer can enter here. When a producer is entering inside this critical section, then the value of mutex becomes 0, because this wait function makes the semaphore variable as a decrement the value of the semaphore variable. It becomes 0, and when it becomes 0, then no other process can actually get access to this particular critical section. Once this critical section is executed, then it execute the signal call on the semaphore mutex. So the signal call of the semaphore mutex again makes the value of the mutex to 1, and another process can enter inside the critical section. Now here you will see that the producer process, it waits on the empty semaphore, and the empty semaphore is initialized to n. So that means until this empty semaphore becomes 0, a producer can produce an item. So that means a producer can produce n number of items which can be put inside the buffer, and it signal the full semaphore. The full semaphore is initialized to 0. When the producer process gives a signal to the full semaphore, it means that it has added a new item to the buffer which the consumer can consume. So the consumer process is the reverse process. So this mutually exclusive part is same. The critical section part is again protected by this mutex semaphore, the wait and the signal function of the mutex semaphore, so that at a time only one producer or only one consumer or one of the producer and consumer can enter this critical section part, access the counter variable. Now this consumer, it wait on the full semaphore. So the full semaphore is initialized to 0. So that means until a producer produces something, a consumer cannot enter to this particular thread, and once the consumer consume the element, then it make a signal to the empty semaphore, and the empty semaphore is initialized to n. So that means whenever you are signaling an empty semaphore, that means you are incrementing the value of that particular semaphore. That means you are making a space free in the buffer, which the producer can produce a new item. So that is this way we basically make a synchronization between the producer and the consumer using this semaphore concept. So there are other conventional problem in our process synchronization, like this readers writers problem that can be solved using the semaphore. Then there is this dining philosopher problem. So these are some of the traditional problems which you can read from the Galvin book, that how this concept of semaphore is actually ensured is actually used to ensure synchronization among multiple processes. Now this process synchronization using semaphore can lead to some problem. So we are directly going to that particular problem. So it is something like this deadlock problem. So what happens, say you think of that there are two processes, say there are two semaphore S and Q, and those semaphore are initialized to 1. Then there are two processes P0 and P1. Now when initially, so say assume this is the case for P0 and this is the case for P1. So P0 first wait for S, then it wait for Q, then it executes the critical section, then it signal S and signal Q. In case of P1, P1 first waits on Q, then it waits on S, then it executes this critical section, then it signal Q, and then it signal S. Now this P0 and P1, if you execute this P0 and P1, what may happen? Say P0 first execute wait S. Once the P0 execute wait S, then the value of the semaphore S becomes 0, and then say P1 executes on wait Q. Once it executes wait Q, again the value of the semaphore Q becomes 0. Now you see that both of this process, P0 will keep on waiting on Q and P1 will keep on waiting on S. But until this critical section get executed, P1 will not be able to signal the semaphore. Similarly, P0 will not be able to signal the semaphore. So that way, basically P0 is waiting for P1 and P1 is basically waiting for P0. So that way we can come to a problem which is called a deadlock scenario. So deadlock scenario means multiple processes are waiting on each other, but no one will be able to make a progress. So this particular scenario, we call it as a deadlock scenario. So in traditional operating system books, you will find out that it talks about different ways of detecting a deadlock and handling a deadlock. So to detect a deadlock, there are multiple methods, like you have to find out whether a process is one process is waiting for one resource, whereas another process is waiting for the resource which is being accessed by the first process. So you have to actually ensure these 4 conditions for a deadlock to happen. One is the mutual exclusion, that means only one process at a time can use a resource. The second is hold and wait, a process holding at least one resource which is waiting to acquire additional resource. There is no preemption, because if there is preemption, you can preempt a process and release the resource, but preemption is not there. And there is circular wait, that is the important condition, that there is a set of process P0, P1 to P1. Now P0 is waiting for some resource which is accessed by P1, P1 is holding some resource which is accessed by P2, P2 is holding some resource which is accessed by Pn, and that way Pn is holding some resource which is accessed by P0. So you have some kind of cycle in the resource allocation graph. So if you have some kind of cycle in the resource allocation graph, you can be sure that there can be some kind of deadlock. But the thing is that we have algorithms like Banker's algorithm, which are discussed in the operating system books, to detect and to prevent the deadlocks. But the complexity of the Banker's algorithm is too high. So the complexity of the Banker's algorithm is basically order of n cube. which is too high for a normal operating system. So the normal operating system basically doesn't implement anything to handle a deadlock. So if there is a deadlock, the best way is to restart your operating system. So remember that none of the modern operating systems, they implement such kind of deadlock handling algorithm because of their inherent complexity. So the complexity of Banker's algorithm and its variants are so high that the operating system doesn't implement them inside the kernel. So, so that's why we will not go to the details of this Banker's algorithm and all these stuffs here. So that is the things, or I would like to cover about this memory management, about this process management things. So what we basically learned here that during the scheduling thing, so whenever you have the cooperating process, you need to basically synchronize among multiple process, and because of that synchronization, you may come up with this deadlock. And if you are coming up with this deadlock scenario, the best way is to restart the system, because none of these modern operating system, they actually implement deadlock as a part of the operating system. So that is all about today's lecture. Let us go to the questions that you have. So in which language Windows operating system code is written? So basically most of the operating system codes are written in C. So for Windows they have, so some part of the operating system they have their proprietary version of the, for example, this Windows say starting from Windows 8 and the others. I know that some part of the code is written as C#, and C# is a proprietary language for Microsoft. But if you look into the Unix or Linux operating system, the Unix and Linux operating system, they are entirely written in C programming language. Indeed, you can just download the kernel source code for a Linux operating system by going to the website www.kernel.org, and from there you can download the latest source code of the kernel, and there you will see that the complete system has nice modularity. There is this modular architecture. There is different blocks for your different blocks for different modules in the operating system, and that is entirely written in C programming language. So the next question is that how can we say that we are in children if PID equal to 0 and we are in parent if PID greater than 0. So what happens actually? So that is a kind of operating system primitive. So if you are running a kind of fork system call, so whenever you are making a fork system call, the fork system call basically, so the fork system call basically create a child process. So the fork system call creates a child process. Now after the fork system call, you have a parent process and a child process. Now the whatever code was there in the parent process, the same set of code is also replicated in the child process, and you have the local variable PID in both the case. Now when operating system creates a child process, what it does, it return the child process ID to the parent process version of this local variable PID, and it returns 0 to the child process version of this PID variable. That way inside child process, if you check PID equal to 0, you know that you are basically going to execute that part of the code. Say for example, after that you have written execute. So if PID equal to 0, that means you are going to execute that part of code inside the child process. And if PID equal to non-zero means greater than 0, you are going to execute that part of the code in the parent process. So rest of the code are there here inside, but the child process will not execute that, because that will not make this condition true. This condition will only become true in the child process, and this condition will only become true in the parent process. So another question is that how does communication occurs through message passing? So there is a primitive called pipe. So pipe is a concept in C based and C based programming language. So you can use the concept of pipe to send a message between multiple processes. So I will request you to look into that how to write a code using pipe in C, you will get many sample codes which you can refer or which you can study to understand how this message passing actually works to make communication between multiple processes. Now, another question is how to calculate the turnaround time in case of round robin algorithm. So, the turnaround time, as we discussed, it is the total time a process is basically inside your a process basically takes to complete its execution. Assume that you have two processes P1 and P2. Okay, so assume that you have two processes P1 and P2, and if you draw the Gantt chart in this way, say this is 0 and your time quanta is say 2 seconds. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Now P1 is executed here, P2 is executed here, P3 is executed here, P4 is executed here, P1 is again executed here, P2 is executed here, and P1 is executed here. Okay. So this is P1, this is P2, this is P1. Okay. So that way we are basically switching between P1 and P2. Now assume that P2, the execution of P2 gets completed here and the execution of P1 gets completed here, and both the process starts at time 0. So that is why the turnaround time of P1 will be equal to 10 seconds, and the 10 second or 10 millisecond, whatever unit you are putting here, and the turnaround time for P2 will be 8 milliseconds. So that way you can compute the turnaround time. So it is basically how much time once the process enters the system, then how much time it takes to complete. So this fork and execution, someone of you have posted a question like you wanted a detailed explanation. So again, so we have to complete the whole thing within 6 hours. So I cannot devote that much of time to go to the very details of fork and exec. The thing is that well, this fork and exec, if we want to discuss the whole thing, this fork and exec itself will take a 2-hour lecture. So what I will suggest you that you can go to the multiple materials which are available in the internet to look into the different aspects of the fork and different variants of the exec system call. And if you have any doubt, you can always contact me for further explanation. So this rest condition, the rest condition, so one of you have explained the question that could you please explain where and how rest condition occurs. So the rest condition is basically something like that two processes are going to execute the critical section simultaneously, and they are getting some invalidate or invalid results. So the example that I have given you, while both the producer problem and the producer thread and the consumer thread, they are going to execute this counter variable. One is incrementing the counter variable and another is decrementing the counter variable. And during that time, what may happen that because of this register operation, you have to transfer the value from memory to register, then increment the value in the register, and then again write back the value to a memory which is pointed by this counter variable. So if there is a overlap between this individual operation, you can get some result. So in the example, what we have seen that you have one producer has incremented, another consumer has decremented. So ideally the value of the counter should remain same, but because of this overlapping of the operations, the counter value became from 5 to 4. So that is a kind of example of a rest condition that may happen. So whenever multiple processes are going to execute operation on some shared variable, there can have such kind of inconsistencies, which we term as a rest condition. When did synchronization required? Again, the simple answer is that when multiple processes are going to execute or going to get hold of some shared resource or shared variable. So obviously, like the example that I have given, that both of the process, two processes are going to write something in a file. Obviously, they cannot write simultaneously in a file, or if there is a shared variable which is being accessed by both the processes or multiple processes. So during that time, you require a method of synchronization to ensure that whatever operations are being performed on these shared resources, those operations are indeed synchronized among themselves. What scheduling algorithms are used in Android? It is to give a single line answer. It is something like multi-level feedback queue scheduling. So multi-level feedback queue scheduling is something like that. So we have talked about this multi-level queue scheduling. So the feedback queue scheduling is something like that. You are taking a feedback from one queue to another queue. Now it is like that one process is initially put in the priority queue, but because of some interrupt or some dependencies with the other process, you are taking back that process to the priority queue and putting it to the another queue. And interesting example can be like your foreground process and the background process. So in Android, you can only have a single thing which is displayed on your device, right? So you can have a single screen on which you can only display one application. Now assume that currently you are displaying your browser and your browser has the highest priority, and at the next moment you suddenly take your browser out of your main display and you put another application on your main display. Then the scheduling algorithm actually moves the browser from the priority scheduling space to some other scheduling queue. That way it uses this kind of multi-level feedback queue scheduling between the foreground process and the background. How can you say that SJF is optimal? So there is a strong mathematical proof of that. If you Google it that proof of SJF to be optimal, you will get the corresponding paper that was possibly written by Lamport, which actually proves that SJF is indeed a optimal scheduling. And the idea is there, means the rough idea is something like that. Whenever you are taking small processes first, obviously the average waiting time gets reduced compared to all other scheduling. So that is the kind of naive approach or the naive idea to say that SJF is optimal, but there is a strong mathematical proof which you can follow from that paper. Starvation problem, one question is like that, when starvation problems was experienced. So the starvation problems are experienced, say the example of a kind of priority scheduling. In case of priority scheduling, if you are continuously getting high priority processes and if you have a low priority process which is currently waiting inside your ready queue, then that low priority process can get starved because it is continuously, the system continuously getting the high priority processes and it is basically giving priority to that high priority process to use the CPU. And the low priority processes keep on waiting for some indefinite amount of time. So that is a kind of starvation that can happen. Descheduling is the scheduling in secondary days. So I am not, I will not touch that particular topic in this lecture series. You have a complete separate chapter in the book on disk management. There you can get the descheduling algorithm. So the descheduling algorithm basically says that if you are getting multiple disk requests simultaneously from multiple processes, then how will you schedule those requests so that your disk access time gets minimized. Sandbox is something like a virtual machine. So in this particular talk, I will not go to the details of this sandbox architecture. Broadly, it is something used for this kind of server virtualization. So virtualization is a very advanced topic of operating system. You can basically follow it. There are multiple tutorials available in the internet which you can follow to know about this sandbox technology and how it is used for server virtualization. So virtualization, well, in the memory management, we will touch a small part about virtualization. I will try to touch or give a hint that how sandbox is utilized in that particular aspect. So one interesting question is that if parent and child share same code, then why the orphan condition occur if they share same amount of resource? So the orphan condition doesn't depend on whether the parent or the child is sharing the code or not. It depends on what you are writing inside the code. So in the code, you are writing that if PID equal to 0 and writing something, that part of the code is executed by the child. But if, and in another if condition, if you are writing that if PID greater than 0, then that part of the code is executed by the parent. So different part of the code is executed by the parent and child. It is not necessary that the same part of the code will be executed by both parent and child. So that way it may always happen that the parent finishes first before the child finishes. And that case, in those cases, the child may become an orphan process. Is IPC a part of synchronization? IPC is not a part of synchronization. IPC is for inter-process communication. Because of inter-process communication, you may require synchronization. So these are mostly the question that are put up in this question box here. So if you have any further question, you can always drop me an email in my official email ID. That is all about today's lecture. So thanks to all of you for attending. In the next talk, in the next class, in the last class, we will basically discuss about the memory management part in brief. Obviously, again, memory management has multiple components. We will not be able to go to all the details, but I will try to cover as much as possible within the time. So thank you to all of you for it.